Today's episode is a creepy one, featuring some very nasty and unsettling hauntings, and a terrifying deep dive into the extremely disturbing stories behind the Pope Lick Monster, also known as the GOATMAN. Welcome back to Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails. Find me on Twitter at Prevails. My newest book is out, titled Phantom Phenomena, which is a hand-picked collection of the scariest stories I've ever told. Get it now on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, link in the description. And if you haven't already, please leave a review to help us reach new fans. Also, you can find this show on your favorite podcast app. Just look for Unexplained Encounters. Leave us a rating there too if you can. Thanks. As always, if you have a scary story of the unexplained, send it to me at darkstories.org. Now, let's begin. The Pope Lick Monster, from The Dark Knight. I lived in Kentucky at the time, and had only recently heard of this infamous beast. I also recently learned that this monster's victims had made the news before. That's right. The Pope Lick Monster has actually killed people. Be warned though, this monster's method of slaying may trigger some folks. Out of respect for the families of the deceased, I will use random names to maintain the integrity of the victims' identities. Allow me to start with some of the earliest encounters I could find on microfilm. In the 1960s, an old man named Jonathan was watching a construction crew work on and sketch blueprints of the Pope Lick trestle. Sources vary, but most agree that old Johnny muttered under his breath, "They shouldn't do this. The monster lives there." Again, sources vary, but most say that about 3 weeks after the bridge was constructed, the old man vanished. Searches were conducted. The police got involved. In the end, all the searchers found were the mangled and bloodied remains of a severed foot. The foot looked as if it had been chopped cleanly off, like an axe was used. This reportedly spurred a short murder investigation into the situation. The police concluded that old Johnny had died, as it had been nearly a week since the discovery of the foot, and he would not have survived. However, they could never be sure if it was even the old man's foot, because DNA evidence didn't exist at that time. The authorities' suspicions were likely confirmed, because in the following weeks, more cleanly cut body parts were discovered, strewn about the forest close to the trestle's construction site. The death was considered a cold case murder after further investigation, because at the time, authorities had virtually nothing to go on, except those random body parts. While the police were still trying to find the murderer, construction workers began to disappear too. While some were tall tales, others were documented in missing person reports. They were said to have just vanished into thin air by the workers who last saw them. Again, more remains were found in the days following the disappearances. There was no solid evidence as to who the culprit was, so the cases became stagnant. However, the construction workers began to see things. Figures darting between trees. A goat bleating that sounded a little bit off. One account from a worker says that he and his buddies were enjoying a smoke break after a long day's work, when, all of a sudden, they heard a man scream, followed by a chopping sound. Immediately, the men stood up, shaken. The woods were silent as the grave, and they quit their job right then and right there. Later, the remains of an unidentified man were found strewn about the forest, cleanly cut, as if by a blade. Those are the first couple of documented Pope Lick monster encounters that have some decent credibility. That is not some spooky story to tell friends around a campfire with s'mores. I mean, this beast had a kill count, and it still wasn't finished. Next, I'll give the encounter of Betty, a teenager who lived near the trestle. This encounter is not fantasized at all, but the name of the young lady has been changed to maintain anonymity. Betty, the 17-year-old from the small town of Finchville, had to drive by the trestle every day to go to her night shift at a local KFC. She would sleep late, do some homework, and then head off to her job. On a Tuesday in October, Betty was doing just that. The drive was roughly 30 minutes to the fast food joint, and she was in no rush. Like every time she went to work, Betty passed by the trestle, oblivious to the horrific history of its construction. She looked out her window to admire the way that the moon shone through the rickety steel beams. Then she noticed a shape, growing slowly in the distance. It looked like a large person was speeding at her car on all fours. The way it moved was all wrong. The galloping motions the creature made were not natural. She sped up, immediately terrified of the figure. For 3 minutes, it kept pace with her car at 45 miles per hour before slowing down as she reached an area where more people were present. Other drivers noticed she was going 20 over the slow 25 mile per hour speed limit and notified the police. They spotted her speeding car and pulled her over. Upon seeing her extreme distress, the officer let her go with a warning, and she slowed down once she couldn't see the dark forest surrounding Pope Lick Road. She made it to her shift and told her coworkers that a deranged creature kept pace with her car. To her utter horror, the coworkers who took the same route as her gave their stories, describing how the creature kept pace with their cars as well. In the early morning hours, Betty left with one of her coworkers, and they headed home, feeling secure in one another's company. That was the last time Betty and her friend, named Sammy, were seen alive. Their car was found in a ditch near the side of the road. Blood was on the dashboard, in the back seat, on the carpet padding, everywhere. There was no evidence of a collision, no apparent evidence of an attack except the 2 horn-shaped indentations on the left side of her car. Exactly 2 weeks and 1 day later, the scattered remains of Betty and Sammy were found around the trestle. The cold case was reopened, and a new set of eyes looked upon the old, dusty files. The hunt for the Pope Lick monster was resurrected. However, nothing was found on the remains, save for what appeared to be goat fur, which officials brushed off as wild animals being interested in the body parts. Betty's coworkers would later come forward, recounting the story she had told about a creature running with her car. I remember when I was a little kid, sitting in the back of my parents' Honda Pilot and seeing a car in a ditch with police surrounding it. This incident was no joke. I asked one of my friends to share their encounter, and they agreed. This encounter came directly from an email he sent me after I asked him about his experience. I think it was in late December, approaching Christmas break. It was snowing a little, so I had to drive really slow, even though the speed limit was 25 miles per hour or something like that. I passed by the train bridge and I saw a shape walking across the bridge. I know there had been reports of kids going out at night looking for the monster, and they'd dare each other to cross the bridge. But this figure looked off. Something about the way it walked just looked wrong. I wasn't in any rush, so I got out of my car and walked close to the bridge, yelling up, telling whoever was up there to get down before they hurt themselves. I heard this loud clopping sound, like hooves on wood, and it sounded like there was a human-like aspect to the footfalls. One clop after the other in a rhythmic way, like a person on 2 legs would walk. Then I heard the sound of goat-like bleating. I've heard the stories about the Pope Lick monster, or the Pope Lick GOATMAN, so I immediately walked briskly to my car and drove away. A giant, furred man with massive horns began to chase my car for a long time, until I got to an area that was more lively. I drove to the nearest restaurant, sat down in a booth, and quietly cried. Nothing has happened since, and I'm grateful for that. One last story. About a month ago, as of writing this, A massive, crudely made axe was found by a metal detectorist who had been searching for old coins under the trestle. The axe had dried human blood on it, but there was too much decay to determine who the blood belonged to. Scientific dating methods suggested that the blood was 20 or so years old, which does directly correspond with the time that Betty and Sammy were brutally murdered. The older stories are directly from my local library's newspaper microfilm collection. The stories of an axe-wielding GOATMAN are true, and not embellished. Embellishing these stories in any way would not do the victims justice. Whatever lives in the woods around Pope Lick Road, it's not human, and it's very dangerous. The Hay Bales. From Thread. I just want to say a few things before I start the story. My dad told me this story at least 2 months ago. His uncle lived in the middle of nowhere surrounded by corn, and his uncle would tell him, "Don't go into that corn." My dad called this a line not to cross. My dad's family wasn't rich. His family would often visit relatives since they couldn't afford anything else. He was 8 years old at the time, and he was outside breaking walnuts with his cousin, who we'll call Jay. They both grew bored after a while, so Jay said, "Hey, I want to show you something." And then he started to walk into the corn. "But your dad told us not to go in there," said my dad nervously. Don't worry. It's just because of the snakes. I'll show you how to get rid of one with a stick." So my dad followed him into the corn. They traveled for about half an hour until they reached the end of the cornfield. Behind it was a meadow, and behind the meadow were 5 hay bales, lined up neatly in front of some woods. Those woods had a messed up history. There was a lady who lived out there a few years ago, and she had a bunch of dogs. One day, though, she and her dogs went missing. A few weeks after that, she was found hanging from a tree with her dogs, and they'd all been skinned. This wasn't a short tree. This tree was 10 feet high. So Jay ran quickly towards the line of hay bales and pushed one out of place. Then he ran back to the corn and hid. He told my dad, "Get down!" My dad listened and crouched low into the corn. They waited for about 15 minutes like that, and my dad asked, "What are you trying to show me?" Jay replied, "Wait, watch, it fixes them." My dad replied, "What fixes them?" They waited a few more minutes. Then what came out scared the living daylights out of him. A tall, bony figure with 4 long claws emerged from the woods and fixed the hay bale. It looked around, then slowly walked back into the forest. My dad looked at Jay and simply said, "What the heck was that?" "We call it a walker," replied Jay. The next time my dad came to visit, Jay told him, "I have a funny idea. Let's push all the hay bales into the woods." My dad agreed, and together they went into the corn. When they got back to the meadow, they pushed the hay bales into the woods and ran back to hide in the corn. But after waiting 10 minutes, they heard a shriek. This shriek sounded like a bunch of people and a bunch of animals crying out in pain. They then saw a hay bale fly from the woods across the field and into the corn. That was a 500 to 600 pound hay bale, and this thing threw it across the meadow like it was a tennis ball. They looked at each other and ran out of there as quick as they could. A few weeks after that, when my dad visited again, they discovered that this thing had pushed the hay bales into the corn. A few years later, Jay and his family moved away from there. Neither Dad nor Jay ever saw that thing again. But my family has had some other paranormal things happen, so stay tuned for those stories. But let this be a lesson to jokers. If you ever stumble upon the territory of something that is beyond the realm of natural, it's probably a good idea to leave it alone. Sighting of the Bear Man. From Leahbeah. My family loves the outdoors. We take every chance we get to enjoy a nice weekend. Often we take family trips to go hiking and camping out. Not too long ago, my dad and I decided to plan a hike. We wanted to hike in an area that we weren't familiar with. I thought it would be a great change of pace. I did some research online and located a trail with a campsite that was rated as an intermediate hike, with a camping spot near the top of a mountain. We would have to bring our camping gear with us up the mountain. The morning of the trip, we woke up at 5 a.m. We organized our camping gear in the car and started the journey. The weather was perfect. We had no trouble finding the parking area to the hiking trail, and we got our packs set up. My dad and I had a great time hiking up the mountain. The wildlife and plant life were abundant, perhaps even a little overgrown along the path. At the top of the mountain, there was a gorgeous view. Down the trail about a mile was where the camping area was set up, near a flowing river. It appeared that we had the place all to ourselves, too. My dad and I enjoyed the peacefulness of the flowing water and the solitude. The sun was starting to set. At that point, we had just made dinner and were leaning back in our chairs when we heard a strange noise through the woods. It sounded like a bullhorn going off in the distance. My dad heard it too. We both looked at each other, thinking, what the heck? I thought maybe it was another hiker trying to scare some animal off, or calling to their group. But we hadn't seen another car in the parking area. We both continued to sit in our lounge chairs, looking around. We'd run into some strange things while camping before. My dad is never quick to panic, so we shrugged off the noise. A few minutes later, the sound of crunching footsteps on the forest floor echoed through the woods. The footsteps quickened pace. The running sound seemed to be getting faster and closer to our campsite. The realization hit us. Someone, or maybe a bear, was running up to our camp and fast. We jumped out of our seats, rushing to grab the knives hooked to our belts. Something appeared from the woodline across the camping area and paused. We ducked behind our tents. I took out my binoculars to get a better look, since whatever it was seemed to blend in pretty well. I zoned in, and what I saw was a man standing there, a bullhorn at his side, and over his face he wore the head of a bear. The rest of the fur cascaded around his body. I was definitely creeped out. He was staring right in our direction. I felt our eyes lock onto each other. I don't like the look of this, Dad, I whispered. All right, we're going to start running back down the trail. The only thing we can do is get to the parking lot as fast as we can, he replied. We prepared ourselves, then took off running from behind the tents. It was a good thing we were heading downhill, I thought to myself. Then, the thud of footsteps behind me caused alarm bells to go off in my head. With my dad in front of me, the bear man was chasing us. Panic set in. I ended up tripping over a tree root, busting my knees and hand. I picked myself up so quickly, it was like nothing had happened. Thank God for adrenaline. I didn't hear any more thudding footsteps behind us, but we continued to run down the rest of the trail. We saw a break in the trees exposing the parking lot. We both leapt into the car. My dad sped off, kicking up dirt and small rocks along the way. A few miles down the road, I realized we'd left all our camping gear behind on the mountain. This made me angry. I said to my dad, "That prick made us leave all our gear behind." My dad replied, "Camping gear is replaceable, but you and I are not. We don't know the intentions of that man." It seems to be the common assumption that he was just a hermit, and we had intruded into his territory. My sister, on the other hand, believes that maybe he was a spirit showing his presence. Either way, I now carry a gun with me whenever I go camping. You never know who you'll run into. Two stories from Amatsubu. These are two personal encounters with the unexplained that left me questioning what I once believed. The first story, the shadow in the garden. When I was 15 years old, I decided to stay at my grandparents' house outside the city. It was a peaceful place, far from the usual hustle. Their home, built in the 1930s by my great-grandfather, had been passed down to my grandfather, who had kept it in great shape over the years. Despite its charm, there were whispers in the family about a haunted past. As a skeptical teenager who watched way too many New Age atheism debate videos, I didn't pay these stories much mind. You see, I didn't believe in ghosts or anything supernatural. It all seemed like nonsense to me, just stories for people who wanted something to be afraid of. But one night completely changed what I believed to be true. It was a perfectly ordinary Wednesday night. I had dinner with my grandparents and headed off to bed in the room I was staying in. I spent a bit of time watching BoJack Horseman on my phone before falling asleep. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up with the urge to go to the bathroom. One thing about old houses where I'm from is that they have an outhouse for a toilet, separate from the house itself. For my grandparents' outhouse, it was accessible through the garden. I stepped out and finished my business, but on my way back to the house, something caught my eye. At first, it was just a shadow, but as I squinted my eyes into the darkness, the outline morphed into something more human. But it stood at least 8 feet tall, with gaunt arms and thick legs. Its silhouette was grotesque, barely human. Then it moved. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it take a step towards me, and in that moment, a primal fear surged through me. This thing, whatever it was, it shouldn't exist. Without thinking, I bolted. I sprinted back to the house, slammed the door shut, and locked it behind me. I shook uncontrollably, sobbing as fear overwhelmed me. I couldn't explain what I'd just seen, but the image burned into my mind like a nightmare that I could not wake from. I stayed up until dawn, too terrified to sleep. When the first light of day seeped through the curtains, I gathered up my things, told my grandpa I wanted to head home early, and left without looking back. I never spoke of that night. My grandparents never seemed bothered by anything unusual in their house, and I was not about to start a conversation that would confirm they might have been right about the haunting, nor was I going to admit that I was wrong. It's been 9 years since that night, and though I visited my grandparents' house multiple times, I've never dared to stay overnight again. After that night, I had difficulty falling asleep for weeks, and I would often catch glimpses of movement in the corners of rooms. This trauma, however, eventually faded, and while I've grown out of the fear, I still can't explain what I saw. Today, I'm not exactly a denier of the supernatural, but one thing is for sure. I have no desire to ever find out more about what I saw in that garden. The second story. The Night Shift Company. It all started during one of my night shifts at the factory. I was relatively new, operating the machines and getting used to the routine. One night, while focused on my work, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. Someone was approaching me. Assuming it was a coworker, I didn't bother to look. But the moment the figure got close, it vanished. I was confused for a bit. but then I brushed it off, thinking my mind was playing tricks on me. That wasn't the only strange thing that happened. A few weeks later, I saw a man walking across the factory floor, dressed in a black shirt and trousers. He casually walked by and then disappeared from my view. At first, I thought nothing of it, but when I mentioned it to my coworkers, their response sent chills down my spine. They looked at each other. Then one of them said it was just a harmless spirit that stays there. My blood ran cold. I pushed them for more details. They told me that while some of them had never personally seen him, they knew he was harmless. He would show up from time to time, walking or standing in random spots, only to vanish into thin air. They mentioned that several workers had been spooked into quitting over the years, but reassured me that there was no need to worry. I seriously considered leaving right then, but the pay was too good, and I was really starting to like the guys at work. They made the place feel comfortable, despite the eerie occurrences. I mostly worked night shifts, and for a while, I didn't encounter anything like that again. Things were going smoothly until one night. I had stepped out for a cigarette during a break, and there he was, standing only a few feet away, staring right at me. His gaze sent a wave of unease through me. He looked like a regular guy, but the fact that he was somewhat otherworldly just didn't sit right with me. I broke eye contact right away and went back inside, trying to shake off that feeling. The next day, I quit. I couldn't deal with it anymore. The stress from those encounters started to affect other parts of my personal life, and I felt like I was on the verge of slipping into depression. And while the money was good, the constant tension it caused was too much to handle. I still don't know what I saw in that factory, but I know it wasn't something I needed in my life. The Creature Who Attended Church. From Cryptids Forever. The Helpful Dead. From StahlHammer. My parents bought a home in January of 1994, in a neighborhood that used to be owned by the U.S. Air Force. The military had sold the neighborhood that previously housed their officers. Not sure why, but in the late 80s, they no longer needed the properties. Over the next few years, starting from the first week we moved in until I moved out in 2009, we collectively experienced creepy, unexplained phenomena. My parents bore the brunt of the activity, but my sister and I were no strangers to these experiences ourselves. This first story is one I tell folks when they say ghosts and the supernatural aren't real. In 1996, my father had just had knee surgery, so he was going to be down for a while. I remember we bought the film Jumanji on VHS and watched it his first day home from surgery. My mom had made Toll House pie, which was a favorite in our house, and a special treat since she only made it for the 3 big holidays each year: Thanksgiving, Christmas, and Easter. My mother knew we liked Toll House pie so much that to make it last a few days without being prematurely consumed, she placed it on top of the fridge, knowing neither my sister nor I could reach it had we come looking for a late-night snack. After the movie was over, I remember my dad passed out on the couch. Since he wouldn't be walking to the bedroom anytime soon, my mother left him with no blanket. My sister and I headed to our rooms, and we said goodnight to our mother as she headed towards hers. The next day, I woke up to my parents arguing. As I approached the living room, I noticed a big blanket on the couch and an empty plate with a fork on the coffee table where my dad had passed out. They began to drill me about going into my mother's room and grabbing a blanket early that morning. I was so confused. I had no idea what was going on. I explained, "No, I was sleeping in my room. What's going on? Why do you think I took a blanket from your room? My mother looked at my father and began telling me what happened in the early morning hours. She said at about 3:30 a.m., maybe 4 a.m., she heard something moving around at the foot of their bed where they kept spare blankets on an old bench. She looked over at the mirror but couldn't see anyone there. After a few minutes, the movement stopped and she went back to sleep. Around the same time, my father says he woke up because he was freezing cold. He looked around to see what time it was. Out of the darkness, he heard a child's voice speak to him, saying, "Here, Dad." He said it scared the heck out of him. All he could do was close his eyes, and when he did that, he felt something heavy drape over him. When he finally had the courage to open his eyes, he saw that he'd been covered with a blanket, and on the coffee table was a plate with a slice of Toll House pie on it, and a fork stuck in the middle. He and my mother were unsettled by this, since all the previous activity in the house was mostly vocal, or things slamming around or opening on their own. Never had anyone been given food before. They continued the questioning when my sister came out of her room. She was 3 years younger than me, so there was no way she could have carried that blanket, let alone grab a piece of pie from atop the refrigerator. I was 9 years old at the time, so even I would have had a hard time reaching the pie, or even plates for that matter. They finally stopped the pie inquisition when they realized neither my sister nor I could reach the top of the fridge, even with a kitchen chair. I asked my dad what happened to the slice of pie, and he began to laugh. I wasn't gonna let a good piece of pie go to waste, even if it was served to me by some unseen entity. I remember laughing and thinking to myself that I wouldn't have been able to eat that pie after that. Many more things continued to happen in that house, all the way until I moved out in 2009. If you guys like this story, I have plenty more, so maybe I'll post again soon. "7 Years of Haunting" from BeefFlavorPacket. This story takes place in my mom's house, starting from about 7 years ago to the present. Yesterday, in fact, as of writing this story, is the last encounter I know about. I'll start by giving a brief background on the history of the house, which we have documentation of. I won't give the exact name of the town, but I'll call it RS. The house was built in 1906 in a small mining town by a man we know as Mr. Chambers. It is a 2-level house with the main floor housing the living room, kitchen, a bathroom, study, and 3 bedrooms. Half of the basement had 2 more bedrooms, a bathroom, and the other half was unfinished, so it was just concrete and framing. Mr. Chambers was a doctor at the town's original hospital, which is situated adjacent from the house, maybe 500 yards away or so. Chambers lived in the house with his wife and daughter. We actually have a few original pictures of the property and family before the surrounding area got developed. There have only been a few families to own the property, my parents only being the 3rd or 4th owners, actually. We moved in around mid-2018. I was 15 years old at the time. Together, there were 6 of us in the house. My 2 sisters, C and G, my brother S, my mom, and stepdad. All of us were around the same age, so I can probably say we were all old enough to understand what was and wasn't explainable. To begin the story, I was the first to experience any activity. In my room, I had situated my bed in the corner, along the longest wall in the room. It was this wall that started it all. The first few weeks were good in the house, until around the 1-month mark. When I was lying in bed at night, scrolling or watching YouTube or whatnot, there started a tapping. It was so faint that I almost couldn't hear it. The tapping would progress from the farthest side of the wall all the way up to the corner by my head. I didn't pay it much mind. I chalked it up to the house settling, old house noises. You know, playing it off as things my parents would tell me. It continued like this for a few weeks. When I no longer let it keep bothering me, it got worse. The tapping turned into loud bangs, usually 5 bangs, starting again from the farthest side of the wall to my head. Once it reached my head, it would tap lightly for a few seconds before stopping completely. Around this time, I realized that the wall I was against was concrete with drywall. There weren't any pipes there, no wood, nothing that could cause those sounds. So finally, I moved my bed away from that wall, placing it in the center of the room under my window. This did help for a while, and the banging subsided. After a couple of weeks like this with no banging, I grew uncomfortable with where my bed was, so I moved it back along the wall. The banging never returned. Instead, something much worse took its place. The first night against the wall, I heard something under my bed that I could only describe as an angry cat's meow, like that sound they make when they're about to break out into a fight. I ignored it the first time, telling myself it was my sister C's cat. After it continued to happen and slowly turned into a deep low groan or moan, I knew I had to do something. I moved my bed to the other side of my room completely and did the only thing I knew how to do. At the time, I was getting into witchcraft, green pagan witchcraft, not the dark kind, and I made an oil out of protective herbs and olive oil. I painted pentacles and crosses across my room, on the window, and door to my closet and entryway. For a while, this helped. There was no activity in my room, but there was still activity. Out in the hall leading to G's room and the stairs, I would hear walking or running. It would go from the top of the stairs down to me and G's door, before going back up the stairs. Eventually, I started having activity in my closet. It didn't matter what time of day it was. Sometimes in the morning, other times in the evening, that same rhythmic tapping would play out on my closet door, in sets of 5, along with the doorknob rattling. It was loose, so it didn't take a lot to get that thing to rattle. But the way it rattled made it seem like someone was in my closet. At that point, I also started getting extreme nightmares. Always knowing I was dreaming, I would wake myself up, but I would always dream of paranormal or demonic things, never really seeing it, but only feeling it. I got fed up, so I finally got some selenite, which is a type of crystal, and placed it on the trim above the door to my closet. I also got Palo Santo and did a cleansing of my room, telling whatever was there that it was not allowed and had to leave. After I did this, I placed more selenite above the door to my room and cleansed myself. From that point on to this day, nothing has ever happened in that room again. In the following months, with there being light activity around, my sister G got the bright idea to try to talk to whatever it was. She was new to witchcraft, but had a draw to the darker, more chaotic side of things. She did this ritual that was supposed to open a portal, placing candles in every cardinal direction. I sat with her on this, but never participated. She tried to communicate with whatever it was in our house, but she never got any responses. As I look back on it now, this was a dumb mistake on both our parts. Me for not reminding her, and her for not closing the portal. Activity in the house spiked, and it began to affect my other sister C, my brother S, and my parents. The energy and vibe grew heavy and groggy throughout the next couple of weeks. Things would go missing, usually things with value. Jewelry, watches, credit cards, wallets. They would all end up in the same spot in the center of the unfinished room of the basement. This became such a commonality that we started to call it our little gremlin. We found humor in it, as to not really let it bother us. Eventually, when S started to come to me and my sister, talking about these dreams he'd been having, where our dog would crawl under his bed and come back out as a dark black mass with holes for eyes and a mouth, that's when we started having concern again. He had these dreams for weeks, and would often go to my sister's room across the hall to sleep with her. As a 13-year-old boy, this wasn't normal behavior. When S and G went back to live with their mom for a while, it was just me and C in the house a lot of the time. Our parents worked a lot and often traveled. One night, C, her boyfriend, and I were in the house alone. We were just messing around, making dinner, when we heard something clatter to the ground and shatter in the basement. C, being too scared, sent me and her boyfriend A down to check it out. We realized that the sound came from G's room that had been empty for weeks at this point. We opened the door and the light was on, even though nobody had been there since G left. A and I walked around the room, trying to find what had fallen. I rounded the bed to find glass from a candle splayed across the ground, but the wax and base were not on the ground with it. I looked up to the shelf probably 5 feet away from where the glass was, and there was the rest of the candle, a perfect circular break in the glass, and the wax was completely untouched. It was as if something just lifted the glass off in perfection and threw it. A and I looked at each other and kind of just shrugged, knowing the kinds of darker things G was into. We went back upstairs to my sister and told her what happened. None of us set foot in that room for a good long time after that. For a while, the activity subsided, and all that would happen would be movement of an object or a knock here and there. Nothing too crazy. I had moved out, though, and wasn't subject to the activity. That was until I moved back in while trying to pay for college, while my partner was in nursing school. That's when I started to experience the activity again, along with my partner, who had never been around it before. In my room, we would hear that same sound of someone walking to the door, waiting for a second, and walking away. Tapping on the other side of the doors and walls, random lights in the room in the dead of night. And then there was my stepdad, who was a Class A skeptic, never once believing that our house was haunted, until things began to happen to him. We would all be sitting in the living room, when from the study, maybe 20 feet from the living room, we would hear what sounded like a woman singing. This was the first instance of my stepdad challenging his beliefs of the paranormal. For about a year, we would hear this singing, hear walking in the living room, the stairs, and the kitchen. Around the perimeter of the living room, there was tongue and groove treatment, and on that we had many sets of fine china, handed down from previous family members. Once I walked into the living room while home alone to find my teacup and plate perfectly set in the entryway to the study, unbroken. Cup sat atop the plate. Weird things like this continued until around last year when the entity finally started to show itself. It started in the study, a tall black shadow with no defining features that you would catch out of the corner of your eye. Orbs flying across the rooms, up the walls. Things started to feel oppressive, dark, and demonic after we began to see it. C started to tell me about how there was tapping on her bed, again in sets of 5, just like what would happen to me. My mom would explain how she saw something walking to the bathroom, or heard footsteps up to her door at night. This was when my sister and I started to believe that whatever this entity was manipulating my mom. She would continually tell us, "No, it's not bad. Whatever is here is not malevolent or evil." She was the only one who believed this. When my stepdad finally started taking our side, that the thing was evil, was when he told us that he was seeing dark shadow people walking around the house standing behind him in his webcam while he was working. He would leave the house terrified. For months, my mom tried to convince all of us that whatever it was, wasn't evil. Day in and day out as activity would arise, we would hear from my mom, "Oh, it's just trying to play with you," or something along those lines. The final thing that happened to me was when I was sitting in the living room one day. I saw this orb go from floor to ceiling. The main floor has 12-foot ceilings. It was bright and blue. Immediately after that, I began to hear singing in the study to my left, and the front door handle began to jiggle. I got up from the couch to see if someone was there, and of course, there wasn't, so I left the house. This happened around the beginning of this year, 2024, and I finally moved out again at the end of May. Though I'm not there to experience the activity anymore, I still hear about it almost daily. I'll get texts from my mom showing me pictures of something that she caught on camera, videos of orbs. Just about a month or two ago, she sent a video of something that looked like a hand dragging its way down her window curtain about 3 times, from top to bottom. She tried desperately to replicate the motion, but couldn't. She told me it wasn't bad, and she didn't feel scared by it, but every other person in the house felt the opposite. We were worried that it was oppressing my mom, manipulating her into thinking it wasn't bad. And finally, just yesterday, I got sent another set of pictures, this time from C. She and my mom were trying to take some pictures of the Halloween decorations they'd set up. In one of the photos, a very clear apparition was in the bathroom. It looked like it had white puffy sleeves, like that of a dress in the early 1900s. Its head and hands over the sink, like it was washing its face. Another picture appeared to show the face of a man with a big beard, but zoomed in you could see that there was another face, mouth agape, looking like a black hole, with 2 black holes for eyes. And the last picture was taken in the direction of the study, where it looked like something was crouched atop the big wardrobe, with the same holes for eyes and a mouth. When I saw the picture, it reminded me of a dream I had not too long ago about my mom's place. In it, there was a demon who would sit on top of cabinets and cupboards. I didn't see the demon until the end of the dream, where I saw it sitting on top of the floating cupboards in the kitchen, where it was crouched down, smiling this giant smile with black skin and yellow eyes. When I was shown the pictures, C told me that my mom saw what appeared to be a cat, not any of the faces that me, C, G, or stepdad saw. We believe that she's only seeing the good because whatever it is, doesn't want her to think it's bad. My sister and I talked about this and have grown more concerned for my mom, because she's a very emotionally vulnerable person. I'm not sure what to do at this point, because I no longer live there and can't actively try to get rid of some presence. I don't know what the thing is, but it is progressively becoming more and more present, showing itself and acting more malevolent than before. I just hope that my mom will stay safe and hopefully, eventually, open her eyes. The Abandoned House. From Echo. This story happened when I was between the ages of 11 and 13 years old. I was your average preteen, dumb with dumber friends and dumb little interests. One of these interests happened to be exploring abandoned or sinister places. I had a friend who I'll call Trix. Trix lived right near a graveyard, with a giant road separating her from the sinister place. My parents were fairly strict. I wasn't allowed to go out on my own. I would need an adult. Being a kid, as soon as we started hanging out at Trix's, I would beg her to go outside, even just for a walk. On the first walk we took, we would constantly dart into bushes or trees if we saw a car similar to my dad's driving by. We were walking through a particularly sketchy part of her block when a car that looked a lot like my dad's drove by. So we hid behind a pine tree quickly. Behind us was an old abandoned house. Despite it being winter, there was no wind, only steadily falling snow. As the car drove by, we heard the door to the abandoned house creak open, and a dog's bark came from inside. Terrified, Trix and I booked it back to her house. But of course, because we had the brains of streamers, I guess, we came back not even 10 minutes later with her phone, deciding to observe from across the road. We saw a lot of creepy things that night. There were 2 windows in the front of the house, one big and on the right side, while the other was on the left and smaller, and it was higher up. We saw hands and tall men in the first window, and an arm in the second, which turned out to be a face with a long neck. At one point, it even tried to climb out at us from the first window, and the door creaked open again. This time we ran through shady alleyways and roads all the way back to her house. However, I remember hearing the crunch of snow about 10 feet behind us, but my friend was running ahead of me. The next day we hung out again, except this time another friend of ours was invited to help figure out whatever it was. We came in broad daylight, but we decided to not enter, as the friend theorized it was just a homeless man with dogs. Eventually, we came to the conclusion that there was a skinwalker involved, this one taking the shape of a dog, which might explain the barking, but who knows. Something is going on with me and my family. From Shady German. Haven't we all seen some strange things? Even if it's just something from the corner of our eyes, something that we know was there. In my family, we've had a lot of these experiences. I asked my father about all I ever told him as a child that I don't remember. So these are the things I remember and the things he told me. The first ever experience occurred when I was around 2. My father put me into my room and went out, downstairs into the living room. I was still small after all, so he left a camera in my room. I would stare at the wall apparently, talking to someone. And on that specific occasion, he swears someone answered back. He said it was a male voice. It was deep and muffled. He ran into the room, but no one was there. "Fenya, who were you talking to?" he asked. And apparently I replied, "My friend." The second time was only a few months later. It was early in the morning, maybe 4 a.m. My dad left his door open, in case me or one of my brothers needed something. I waddled in and my father asked me, "Hey, sweetie, what's wrong?" I sniffled and told him, "Daddy, there's a man in my closet and he doesn't stop talking. Make him go away." When he went to check, he didn't find anyone. I remember when I was 8, I was sitting in my room drawing, when right next to me, I swear I saw a pen start to float. And I mean literally start levitating. I ran out and heard it drop. There's a dark corner in my room which, no matter how dark it is inside, is always darker. You could shine a flashlight there, and it would look normal, but not if it was dark. I often just got that dread feeling, started crying and had to run out because something kept telling me to get out. I saw heads flashing from door frames, and a shadow girl standing in the hallway who walked away into the kitchen after about 4 seconds. And my brothers swear they saw me smiling standing there from out the window. But I then walked by them and I never saw that doppelganger thing myself. Something is wrong, either with that house or with our family. 2 weeks ago, I heard my brother scream from the basement. But the thing is, he was next to me. Dad wasn't home, so one of my other brothers took a gun and yelled out, "I don't know who you are, But get the heck out of our house! You are not welcome here. Get out! We heard a creak, and something answered in a warped version of my brother's voice.
My house, not yours.
The gun-holding brother shut and locked the door. Fenya, go get a lock, he said. I ran and got 3, because 1 would not be enough in my opinion. We put them all on, just to be safe. We told our father as soon as he got home, but he just said that we shouldn't go into the basement. Our mother was on business trips often, so I couldn't ask her to fix the lock on the door since no one else knew how to. Whatever, I thought. I didn't need a working lock. But that very same night, I heard breathing outside my room. It got closer and closer until it was right outside my door. The door creaked and it opened up. The next thing I heard was a breathy laugh. It sounded like a very old man who had smoked all his life. I was frozen. It wasn't really open. I couldn't see outside. I did what any scared child would do despite being 16. I pulled the covers over my head and I prayed. I heard the door open wider and I prayed more frantically. I don't know why, but I passed out and awoke to my father shaking me awake. Are you okay? He asked. Are you hurt? My father sounded very concerned. What? No, I'm not. Why? Well, your brother heard you scream last night. I'm not kidding when I say that sent shivers straight down my spine. I've been sleeping in my brother's room since then, the one that got the gun that one time. He said the first night he had a nightmare about a man in our house. My dog keeps barking at my room, and I'm too scared to sleep alone in there again. Things keep happening, and if something else crazy happens, I'll give you an update. Thank you for tuning in to Unexplained Encounters. If you're not already, follow and listen to Unexplained Encounters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Leave us a rating while you're at it. Get some cool creepy merch at eeriecast.store. Check out my other show where I narrate scary work stories. It's called Tales from the Break Room. For more terrifyingly entertaining shows from EerieCast, go to eeriecast.com. And if you want to listen to Unexplained Encounters and all the other EerieCast shows without pesky ads, sign up for EerieCast Plus at eeriecast.com/plus. You'll also get exclusive access to horror audiobooks only available to EerieCast Plus members. And you'll get 20% off our EerieCast.store merch through our members-only monthly discount code. Finally, if you have a scary story of the unexplained, send it to me at darkstories.org. I think that's about it. Thank you so much for joining us. Stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.